for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Asmaret Askedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center, and I'll be your host for today's lecture. Our speaker today is Henry Sokolski, and his lecture is called Proportionality and the Military Targeting of Nuclear Plants. Henry has had a long career in the nuclear policy field. He is currently the Executive Director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. He is also a Senior Fellow for Nuclear Security Studies at the University of California at San Diego. Prior to his current positions, he's held positions in the Pentagon, the National Intelligence Council, and the Senate's Armed Services Committee. Henry's lecture is based on a couple papers he's recently written about the dangers of targeting nuclear power plants during wartime and what U.S. policy should be towards countries that target nuclear plants, such as Russia's targeting of Ukraine's largest nuclear plant after its invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. Henry will take about 30 to 45 minutes to give his lecture, and then we'll transition into the Q&A session. During the lecture, feel free to start raising your hands electronically and writing questions into the chat. You don't have to wait until the end. With that said, Henry, it's my pleasure to welcome you to CGSR. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Okay. They say you're supposed to be very careful if someone inflates your resume. Could come back to haunt you. So, yeah, I worked for someone, a little-known senator from Indiana, Dan Quayle, who became vice president, who sat on Armed Services, but actually, I didn't serve on Armed Services Committee. Just so try to be honest as much as possible. The purpose of today's talk, I guess, is making the case for proportionality, because I think it's taken a number of hits, no pun intended, between the activities of Russia and Israel. And I think the headlines have produced a certain amount of cynicism with regard to the concept. And I think what I'll try to argue is there are strategic and military reasons for why we need to hold on to the concept. And even though the legal application of the concept may be a little rebuttable, I'd say questionable, the concept itself and the need to support it is real for national security reasons. And we're going to use the example of reactors and nuclear plants as targets for two reasons. The proportionality, of course, refers to the idea that you shouldn't go out of your way to hit civilians or civil objects. And I think the purest example of proportionality has to do with the civil objects. And the reason why is there are other rules that can be applied nationally and internationally in attacking innocents besides international law. And usually, well, or occasionally are actually applied. I think that the case of hitting civil objects is a much purer, abstract exercise, which I think is important too, and we'll get into that. In any case, the reactors are interesting because of all the objects that are civilian. Hitting them entails the risk of releasing what they call dangerous or hazardous forces, radioactivity in this case. And boy, it could be quite widespread, at least when you do the analyses with the models. And there's nothing quite like that, at least in theory and probably in practice. So I've sort of given you a general overview of what we kind of try to do. In the spirit of the Texas school of tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, let's at least take a look at the specific questions. There's no reason to move the charts. I'm going to spare you that. Yeah, like I said, please take that down. It's enough to scare anyone off. there are 7 questions I hope to answer in today's presentation. I apologize, but this has become kind of a complicated topic. Um, the first is, given Russian and Israeli targeting of civil structures, what might proportionality's future be regarding the military destruction of civil objects? I guess the short answer to that would be not great if you're talking about it as a legal concept. If you go and take a look in American litigation, you don't find people using the concept of proportionality to find anyone guilty or to prosecute. It's simply not something you're going to see. Um, Internationally, I think it is used, but then getting those rulings enforced is kind of difficult for obvious reasons. They're international rulings. Um, in any case, that's the first question. The second is, why is the targeting of nuclear plants a good test case? I think the short answer to that is uh, they release potentially the most hazardous forces as far as area and effect, and that you could end up with kind of a salting of the earth in really bad cases where people just can't live; they have to move, and that's a pretty big deal. Uh, the next question is, how have reactors' military vulnerabilities changed over the last 20 years? And a related question, who might be targeted next? Here, I think the short answer is, unlike the past, today's precise missiles and drones can hit specific nodes of the plants. And this will be a worry for reactors operating war zones at Russia's near abroad, the Middle and Far East. Uh, the next question that we'll take a look at is, uh, given the Ukraine war, what should we now be worried about regarding nuclear plants in combat zones? Here is a rather, a long list, but it includes, how resilient are populations to losing electrical supply? How resilient are populations if they're exposed to risks of radiation leaks? Um, how vulnerable are electrical supply utility systems to foreign preparations and covert recruitment of their own staff? Um, Also, how resilient are electrical supply systems to physical assaults? And finally, how resilient are military alliances to uncertainties of attacks and different perspectives on what constitutes a war crime? The next question is, what the radiological consequences might be of military assaults. In the worst case, well, it could be nothing. I mean, this we need to understand. It could be nothing. They could do assaults without producing a radiological release. On the other end of the spectrum, it could cause massive evacuations involving hundreds of thousands and perhaps conceivably millions of people. Uh, that's a big deal. Um, the next question is, what can be done technically to mitigate these risks? And here, hardening active and passive defenses, and something which I don't think our government has given serious thought to, not building reactors in war zones, which would save a lot of aggravation with regard to the trouble budget here. The final question that this presentation will take, what practical application of proportionality can the Pentagon and our government embrace? And I think there I'm going to come down with, we can sort of promote international law by the way in which we do performance reviews, roughly, of people who are, in the Pentagon. I worked there, who are constantly concerned about performance reviews. Uh, and I think gaming will be very important. some of these scenarios, and maybe even letting some of that gaming be known publicly, which is something Pentagon is very uncomfortable doing, but maybe it needs to get over that. Not all of it, but some of it should be made public, and certainly working with others in the gaming. And ultimately, I think the interpretations of various legal documents need to be adjusted a little. All right, so that's an awful lot. Um, let's go to slide, our first gray slide. That's okay. Keep going. That's not gray. That's orange. There we go. All right. Okay. Here, let me deviate a little bit from the PowerPoint. Um, the short answer to what might the future. I've already said I don't know that proportionality is that great of a legal prosecutorial instrument. Um, but I think we need to make a case, and I think we've lost our way in making the case for why proportionality matters. I think originally well, not originally, most recently in the last 80 years, proportionality as a legal international concept emerged after the incredible devastation of the Second World War. I mean, everyone gave it the office for this. I mean, the Japanese did horrific things to the Chinese, biological attacks, city busting. It really was just unbelievable. I think the amount of death rained on innocents in Asia probably exceeded what went on in Western Europe. That story doesn't generally get told. We don't have to go over how horrible the Germans were, particularly as they moved east, uh, and the barbaric things they did to the populations they encountered. And not to forget entirely, but the U.S. and British engaged in area bombing, which I think they more than knew it was going to kill a lot of civilians, and it did. I mean, to give you some idea, the number of people, according to the UN, admittedly not a great, you know, standard, but a standard, uh, that have been killed in the Ukraine war that are civilian innocents, I think now measures somewhere between in the neighborhood of 40 to 50,000 people. I may have that wrong, but not by much. Um, that may not be the actual figure, but that's the figure they claim. Well, that's the number of people that were lost in the bombing raids alone in 2 nights at Cologne. So, that's a big number. And that was not, people knew at the time that there was a problem with that. And the British in particular are very uncomfortable with the area bombing. Actually, to their credit, they were. Um, but in any case, the legal concept that states need to avoid this and that international law will prohibit it and describe it, and that there will be actions taken against states that do this kind of damage is fine and well, but I don't think it's really gotten traction, certainly not in the US legal system. Um, if you take a look at the original concept, which is sort of based roughly on Catholic insights into the laws of war. It had an awful lot to do with an ethical focus, not on states or laws, but on the ethical behavior of military commanders. I think that's closer to what makes sense. I would make an adjustment, and that is today it's worth reflecting on the military operational and strategic case for upholding the concept of proportionality. And even in the case of civil objects, which of all the things that can be destroyed, is at least not immediately as horrific as, murdering people in mass. I, I'm going to sort of give you four kinds of ideas. Some of them might not be terribly persuasive, and that might be because they're not. But it's worth thinking about, and maybe you can come up with your own judgments as to how persuasive you think these various ideas are. One might be that, if you go after civil objects and do massive destruction, you may lose the hearts and minds of the enemy that you're eventually hoping to, you know, come to some understanding about a peace. You may extend the war. Now, I think this has been argued by serious people. Certainly, when you take a look, uh, there's a thing called the Strategic Bombing Survey, which was done by the Army Air Corps, I believe, roughly after the Second World War, and they make the argument that uh, the atomic bombing wasn't necessary, which is a little. Uh, I think that's hard to get clarity on. Unfortunately, either way. Uh, but their argument was, well, they could have brought the war to a close simply by blockade, and that was eminently doable. And this would argue probably also against firebombing Tokyo for that matter. So, people have seriously considered this. Um, Arguably, the mobilization and the persistence of the Germans. I've heard two arguments. One is that it steeled their resolve, and then they began to mobilize in 1944 after the bombing occurred. And the other is no, it actually had an effect in bringing the war to a conclusion. Anyway, so that's one argument, and as I say, it's got strengths and weaknesses. The next, I suppose, would be um, we need to think about what the effect of wanton destruction imposed by us might be on us. This argument's a little harder to get a handle on, but I think it has a certain, maybe a greater power. I mean, if you, as a self governing nation, and I still think we're self governing, you need to have self discipline. And if you encourage large portions of your population to go overseas and engage in wanton destruction, they come home. You set an example for what's acceptable. It could cause problems for your ability to have self discipline at home. Again, a bit of a stretch. Luckily, we haven't had to deal with that directly in a big, big way yet. But it's a consideration. People have written about that. I think the next argument has to do with allies and alliance cohesion. You can see these are not super strong arguments, but I will end on one that I do think is strong. So hang in there. Uh, the allies have a very different view than us on this question of targeting civil objects and proportionality. They think it's a war crime, and we'll see this in the presentation. And if you don't, you have a difference of opinion of how to proceed, and you get into arguments, and it's not good for alliance relations. And if you need alliances to win, you need to think about that. Finally, I think the strongest argument is one that a general explained to me. He once asked him, I said, well, what is it that's critical in war for a general to know? He said, really only one thing. Well, two things. He said, first, you have to figure out how to get perfectly civilized, law abiding people to want to use a gun to kill people they don't even know. He said, that's not that easy. He said, but then the hard stuff begins. I said, what's that? Once you get them to the point where they will fire at the enemy, about 10 to 20% of them get a taste for it. And your job as commander in chief of your area is to go to the front, not to lead, but to pull these people who, enjoy being undisciplined and make examples of them and send them home. You cannot, he said, win a war if people get into the habit of not being disciplined and just do anything they want. I think that may be the strongest argument for proportionality with regard to military. security and something that actually is pretty serious. Okay. I've already explained briefly why the targeting of nuclear power plants is a good test case for civil object. Hazardous forces, they can be distinguished as a civilian object. And I encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to bother reading the pertinent sections of Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, which lays out why you should give the benefit of the doubt to any electrical power reactor, a generating station, uh, or any other civil object, that in the case where it might support military activities, uh, you have to really show that it clearly is. And if there's any doubt, you should not target it. I think by that standard, it's pretty clear that Putin has violated Protocol 1, which actually the Russians are somewhat concerned with. They tried to arrange things where they said, well, we won't allow anyone to prosecute us in the international court, but they're still members of the protocol. By the way, when you do the reading that I've given you, I think I made that. I said, well, they're not really members. When I made that argument, it was a shorthand for, well, they actually are members, but they just don't feel like anyone can enforce it against them. But they still are concerned about the court of public opinion, and they claim they haven't violated it. And yet, I think a pretty solid case can be made. Yes, they have, because the plants that they've hit uh, are so indirectly related to anything military that they don't meet the test under Protocol 1 of being of direct support. In other words, powering radars or powering a base. And at most, you could say, well, they power the transport system. That somehow is related to bringing stuff to the front. According to Protocol 1, sorry, that's not good enough. So you can distinguish, I think, the reactors or the nuclear plants, there are other kinds of plants, as a civilian object. And I think, and I'll make this case as we go, that they can be disabled without obliterating the entire site, which also makes it an interesting test case. And of course, the best is, the idea that reactors might be targeted isn't so academic or theoretical. I mean, I counted at least 13, if not more, instances in the Middle East where reactors were hit. Luckily, they weren't power reactors that were turned on. But in the case of the Ukraine, it is. So let's go into the next question and the next slide. Okay, how has the vulnerability to military assaults changed? And who might be next? Let's go through these quickly. They're fun. Well, here's when the median miss distance, or the circle of error probable, describing where half of the bombs would come closest to the intended target, was 75 square miles. Now, there's only half of the bombs in the beginning of the Second World War fell within 5 miles of the target. If you pi r squared, you get 75 square miles. So to compensate for that, this is the way bombing was done. You'll see there's nothing standing. And this was, I believe, I want to say Nagasaki, but it didn't look any different really from that much from Tokyo firebombing or, Cologne or any of these others. It was pretty awful. Okay, fast forward. Well, without getting into the median cases, the precision guidance today allows you to hit someone sitting in the back seat of a car so that the driver can open the door and get out. This is an extreme example of precision, but it's not what it used to be. And this means that you're ethically given choices. Ethics has to do with which choice you make. We have choices now and options that we did not have in 1944, 45. Next slide. And there are a lot of these missiles, not just us. I mean, all God's children are getting them. These are some examples. Next slide. It's pretty good. This, I believe, is, I want to say this is Hamnu. I could be wrong, but Hamnu, Laurel, uh, Iskander, they're all pretty similar. The missed distance is measured in a few meters, and this shows how accurate it can be. Next slide. And then, you have drones and Chinese drones, Iranian drones, Turkish drones. Watch this spot, North Korean drones. And my favorite, the Amazon drone, which means that folks in a country who are agents can buy things that can do the job locally. These things, of course, are immensely accurate and are able to carry enough explosive to target to do an immense amount of harm. Next slide. Well, and we saw this in 2019. A non-state actor backed by Iran penetrated 3 layers of advanced defenses, knocked out 5% of the world's oil capacity. And you see those holes? Israeli intelligence said, well, that means that the missed distance was, 1 meter. Pretty good. Next slide. Okay, what does that mean with regard to reactors? Well, it means that you can pick parts of the place to hit. You can hit the incoming power lines, you can hit the diesel generating station, steam generating pipes that might be exposed, the control room if it's outside of the building, or you can go, try to hit the nuclear island if you can get through the containment building. Now, everyone wants to say you can't do that. It's just not possible. I think that's wrong. Tandem munitions, which have been around since the Germans devised it, can get through an awful lot of concrete if they want to, and the coupling is not impossible. And then, of course, the king of targets, if you want to be totally indiscriminate, is spent fuel ponds if they're located outside of the building, and in many cases they are. Luckily, in the case of Zaporizhia, they're not, but in an awful lot of other cases they are. Next slide. Well, this is sort of an eye chart, but what it suggests is that, you know, if you want to scare people, you aim your missile at whoever is the director of the plant, not him personally or her personally, but their car in the parking lot. The explosion goes off, people see that, and everybody shuts down the plant, and people in the local area get in their cars and drive as fast as they can away from that. Nobody's hurt, but it causes chaos. It may cause shutdowns at other plants for fear that they're next. At the high end, you've spent fuel ponds, which can produce conceivably Chernobyl-like effects. And then there's things in between where you can pick gradations climbing up the ladder of escalation. This is an interesting target set. I think to within limits, the Russians understand this and have played this like a violin. Okay, next slide. Now, I think I'm going to pass over this, but these strikes in the Middle East suggest that reactors have been targeted. Luckily, not operating power plants. And what's also interesting, and in contrast today, it was an all or nothing kind of destruction because the accuracies weren't that great, and you use fighter bombers or inaccurate scuds. So you either missed in the case of Dimona in Iraq, or you hit it and it was eliminated. So that's different, and I think we shouldn't get too caught up in those examples because they're the optimistic historical set. The current and future current time and future we're moving into, you're not going to have that going in your favor. Next slide. Well, who next? Well, if you want to get crazy, Dimona was threatened to be hit, with one of these missiles, the 110. The UAE plant was threatened with a Scud-like missile, and they had drills, massive ones, which were kept out of the news to try to figure out what to do if they ever did get hit. So I mean, these things again have a certain traction in reality. Next slide. You have the Armenian case where there were threats made. Luckily, nothing was done, and they had the memes. They had a Israeli Loral missile, which pretty accurate. Anyway, that was superseded by what Putin did. It was a sort of a dry run rhetorical jaunt into we're going to do X, and luckily they didn't. Next slide. This more realistic, flying, exploding a large munition 1,000 feet from a power plant, assaulting Zaporizhzhia repeatedly, hitting a research reactor and disabling it, and shelling Ravine. These, again, are less theoretical. And these are operating plants, and in some cases, operating power plants. Next slide. Additional Russian threats. I mean, if you listen to the Russians, they're going to blow you up with nuclear this, nuclear that. But they went out of their way to say, well, we could target power plants in Western Europe, which I think is a nice touch. I mean, we worry about them starting World War III. We don't listen to this as so much, but I don't know. This may be more likely than starting World War III. Next slide. Then you have, the targeting of East Asian reactors, which has been threatened. The North has threatened to do it against South Korea and Japan. There was reason to believe that the Chinese have done preliminary planning to possibly do it against Taipei. And, you got to be concerned. Next slide. To give you some idea, when I proposed to do a war game with one of the countries in which one of their reactors got hit and contacted their government people and some even retired generals, they said, too sensitive a topic to talk about. Well, okay, it's a public utility. If a public utility gets hit, you got to have a public narrative about what to do. If it's too sensitive to talk about now, it's not going to get better after it gets hit. I think we can dispense with that. This is just a quote of a threat that Pyongyang made. Go to the next slide. Okay. Okay, what should we be worried about in combat zones? This is sort of an iteration, but let's proceed. Well, one question is, it may not be as much of a worry as we think, depending on how resilient the population is to being deprived of electricity or be exposed to radiation. And I think your mileage will vary depending on who you is. Clearly, the Ukrainians showed incredible resiliency last winter. I don't know whether they will this, because this winter, or more recently, excuse me, not this winter. Well, this winter they were resilient as well. But as more and more of the electrical grid comes down, and it is coming down, this is being tested. But I'd have to give the Ukrainians pretty high marks. I think in the Second World War, almost all the parties were incredibly resilient to the loss of electrical supply, but then not as much of the rural areas were electrified. What will be the resiliency of populations in Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, if their electrical systems are brought down? Hey, there you go. And you thought we ran out of PhD topics. There's one. You could do that. As far as resilient to radiation leaks, I think so far the data suggests fear and loathing, in that Chernobyl helped prompt the collapse of the Soviet Empire. People thought that if they couldn't even promote safety, that wasn't going to be listened to, there was no point in supporting the regime at all. It was one of the ingredients for the collapse, not the only one, but a pretty major one. Uh, the Japanese government collapsed after Fukushima, and in the Middle East and East Asia, it's unclear what would happen. I would be pessimistic, though. Okay, next slide. Then you have this problem of in Ukraine, some of the senior staff running the utility was implicated in allowing or encouraging certain folks who meant to do evil things against the utility, who were working for the Russians, into the system. So you have a kind of an insider threat that exceeds anything that we're currently worried about, which is, a terrorist getting through. Well, what if the head of your operation is an insider themselves, letting insiders in? This could be a bigger problem. So for those of you that are in the internal security business, this is a growth area. Next slide. With regard to escalation, you have these statements. This one was the first. Let's make it clear. This fellow is the head of the British Commons Defense Select Committee. Any deliberate damage, good luck determining what's deliberate, causing potential radiation to a Ukrainian reactor would be a breach of Article 5, where we have to come to their defense. And what was his thinking? Oh, well, the radiation might waft onto NATO territory. Okay, now if it was just him, you say, okay, fine. Next slide. Nope. Uh, bipartisan Senate support for this concept. And of course, the Russian rejoinder is, well, if you invoke Article 5, we go to war against you, a nuclear war. I mean, I don't know how credible that is. But this all ought to be kind of scoped out a little. Yeah? Okay, next slide. I think we can, you can divide the alliance talking about nuclear plant security, because I think the United States, and arguably to some extent the French, have a view that's a little different than the rest of NATO. And the Russians were egging us on to take this topic on because we thought it would cause yelling and screaming. Well, that's a problem. I don't know. Luckily, it didn't. But you can tell they're trying to play the game. Next slide. Here are some places that can get painted with radiation. This was a modeling that was done by Mr. Kang. I think this was published in the bulletin. You've got NATO, you've got, in the case of Poland and Turkey at a minimum, possibly, getting irradiated if the wind's going in the wrong direction. Next slide. We had a war game. You can read it. It was published in the bulletin, and very bizarre. The game had both Biden and Trump people on the teams, and they all agreed that we had to prevent Poland from helping Ukraine retaliate against Russian strikes against Ukrainian reactors. And we actually used Article 5 to keep Poland from siding with uh, Ukraine. And the argument was, well, we can't do anything until it's unanimous, and we're forcing you to vote Article 5 to keep you from helping the Ukrainians by yourself. That's an alliance problem, which was not planned on in the game, but was really kind of mildly eye widening. Next slide. Okay. Looking at the watch here, how many more minutes do I have to get to 45?
About 5 more minutes, but if you need to take longer, that's fine.
Well, God, I think everyone's probably, their ears are bleeding at this point. Well, okay, let's see what these things look like. They may not deserve anything but a look-see. Okay, prevailing winds, Taiwan. This is a reactor in the south. Depending on which way it goes, it could be of almost no consequence to Taiwan, or it could paint Taiwan itself and force massive evacuations. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands and conceivably more people hitting the road, making military operations pretty problematic. Uh, this was used against the referendum to start the fourth reactor, by the way. This research had some political consequences. Next slide. Again, one of the fun things about some reactors is when 6 months out of the year, the wind blows more radiation into Japan than it does South Korea. We'll have a game probably next year where this is played out in the case of trying to make sure that South Korea and Japan don't do anything to help Taiwan by having the North Koreans do an attack like this, which ties everything up. Next slide. Well, if you hit spent fuel ponds, Katie barred the door. Keep going. That's too horrific to even get your head around. You destroy a nation essentially. Salt an awful lot, conceivably. Um, the Middle East, it just gets worse. Okay, next slide. All right. Well, you can do some things with existing plants if you wanted to, and some of these things I think have been discussed. Let's throw them up quickly. Well, some people are selling small modular reactors, and you can dig them underground. You can proliferate them. They don't have as much waste, blah, blah, blah. I think the problem with this is that as you go underground, you encounter what's called groundwater. Next slide. Also, I think it's rather optimistic to think that penetrating munitions, of which there are plenty, can't deal with this unless you go very far underground and then you encounter the groundwater issue. So I think the small modular reactor pitch deserves a little tough love. Next slide. Well, iodine pills, missile defenses, fire drills, and then hardening with ultra hard concrete. Depending on how enthusiastic you are, you can do these things. There's a little bit more. What else? Well, please take as much spent fuel out of a soft pond and put them in a hard container. Maybe make a separate control room somewhere else remotely. Spray ponds. Right. Next slide. I think we're going to call it quits here. Yeah, this is sort of the same thing. But you can build cages, which optically might not promote the product very much, but would you go back to the bird cage if you would. This would deflect tandem coupling charges with missiles. They'd have a hard time coupling. They go off and they do some damage, but they might not penetrate. Next slide. And this might be the last, which would keep us sort of on time. Well, what else could you do for future plants? Think twice. We're going to build, if you believe the World Nuclear Association, hundreds of plants in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, uh, somewhere in the Middle East. It's not clear. You can harden them and actively defend them. I think that increases the costs. I would think realistic testing against reactors is in order. Now, you know, you, a new form of nuclear testing activity. This should be of interest to the labs. Certainly, we have a weirdness with regard to offsite liability, if you know about this. The government says, well, if there's radiation that goes beyond the gates of a reactor site, mostly the U.S. government will assume responsibility once it gets much over, let's say a billion to 13 billion, depending. Now, the small modular reactor crowd says, oh, they have walk-away safe plants that the radiation won't leave the site. Great, then they don't need the liability. And as soon as you say that, they come back and say, no, 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 we have to have it. Well, which is it? The testing might help. Last slide, I think. Okay, I'm not going to go through any more slides. I'm just going to end out. I think we need probably to do better. Actually, this slideshow kind of left out the ways in which you can disable a plant without decimating it. And I think it involves, in some cases, hitting electrical generators, hitting incoming or outgoing, I should, power lines. All of this can be examined. But long story short, if this is an issue worth focusing on, it seems to me that a commander's performance can be graded by how well they plan or execute attacks against these plants, if they choose to, without releasing harmful or hazardous forces or radiation. And that requires gaming, planning, and performance reviews on how good those plans are. I don't know that that's a legal concept, but it would reinforce the notion amongst commanders that they need to take this seriously. I think currently, if you take a look at the legal strictures and interpretations by the Pentagon on this, ultimately they say the commander can make a decision if he thinks it's important to hit a target. It's a nuclear plant, even if it releases harmful forces. I think that's kind of nuts. It seems to me that it's kind of like saying they can release a large amount of radioactivity with a tactical weapon without going back to their political overlords in the White House for permission. I think they do require that in the case of tactical weapons. I think they do need to ask for that kind of permission in the cases of the targeting of reactors. I was told indirectly by someone very senior, it may not be true anymore, that at one time we actually, in our PSYOP, allowed nuclear weapons to be used to target reactors. I got to believe that's a bad idea under all circumstances. And, you got to hope it's not the case. All of this needs to be opened up, it seems to me. Okay. On that note, I think I've exceeded my limit, so we should open it up.